This drought has been the most intense one-year drought in Texas history. That's a blanket statement. Of course, Texas is a large state, and the evolution of the drought and its impacts vary from location to location. So I'll only be able to provide a broad brush summary of conditions, but you'll hear more later in the day about some of the details and particular impacts. You can almost date the start of the drought to a particular day, September 27, 2011, because September was 2010, because September was a very dry, a very wet month across most of the state of Texas. And beginning in October, we started having a sequence of relatively dry months. By the end of February, most of the state was in drought conditions. At that point, it wasn't a remarkable drought by any means. It was a bit drier than you normally have during an La Nina winter, which normally produces dry conditions. The main impacts at that point had been on the winter wheat crop and winter forage, as well as an initial drying out of vegetation that had grown during the wet year of 2010. Then in March, March was the driest March on record for the state. We had major wildfires in late March and April. March through May was the driest March through May on record. June through August was the driest June through August on record. And so we transitioned in the spring from a serious drought to an unusually intense one. Along with the dry weather, which can be summarized in the 12-month period, October through September of this year, we had averaged across the state of Texas slightly more than 11 inches of rainfall. The final numbers aren't in yet, but that number is 2.5 inches below the previous record, which was set in 1956, and is approximately 40% of the normal precipitation for a 12-month period in Texas. The drought affected all corners of the state. The only portion of the state which was not in exceptional drought conditions at some point during this drought has been the area around Dallas and points north and east of it. So it's easier to talk about what was not exceptional than what was, but even that area suffered under the record heat during the summer, which was brought on primarily by the dry conditions. So as a result of that, the summer of 2011 was the hottest summer on record for Texas by approximately 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And furthermore, it is in a virtual tie with Oklahoma for the hottest summer ever recorded within the United States. Both Texas and Oklahoma broke a record that was established during the Dust Bowl. For the purposes of understanding the drought and its impacts, I think it's important to put it in a historical context. The drought itself has been just 1 year to date, but to that extent, it has been perhaps definitely the most intense one-year drought on record. I mentioned the rainfall records. A common drought index is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it reached its lowest value on record at the end of September of this year. So by that measure, it's the most intense. However, there are several droughts in the past that deserve to be mentioned in the same context. Of course, the most significant drought in Texas history has been the 1950s drought, which lasted roughly from 1950 to 1957. And it was severe because it was long-lasting, and it had several intense drought years in the middle of it. As a general rule, the longer the drought goes, the more severe the impacts on water supplies. It only takes about 6 months of dry weather to have a devastating impact on farming and ranching in a particular year. But as drought year adds upon drought year, the water supply impacts gradually grow in importance. Other historic droughts, the drought of 1915 to 1918, which set the record for the driest calendar year, the drought of 1925, and also a prolonged drought during the early 1960s. but although it's difficult to compare, in my judgment, this is clearly among the top 5 droughts, and has been most severe in certain ways. You'll notice in the list that I provided, I haven't mentioned any droughts since the 1960s, and in part that's because over the long term, precipitation has been gradually increasing within the state of Texas. We tend to receive about 15% more rainfall presently than we did at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's not clear whether that trend is going to continue. But what it has meant is that the major drought of the 50s, which brought about considerable investment by the state in infrastructure and water supplies, that infrastructure has not really been tested by a comparable drought until possibly this one. The drought, although characterized as a one-year drought, we have had several important droughts in recent history. 5 out of the past 7 years have been drought years, and parts of the state had so little rain in 2008 and 2009 that 2010 really didn't break the drought in retrospect. And in parts of South Texas and perhaps most significantly a wedge of East Texas stretching from roughly the Bryan-College Station area to the Louisiana border, the 4 years from late 2007 to present have been the driest 4 years on record, with important impacts for reservoirs in East Texas. Going forward, this drought is likely to last another year at least, because the primary trigger of the drought, the La Nina in the Pacific, has returned. About 4 out of 5 La Nina years bring relatively dry weather for the state, particularly during the winter time. So it's extremely unlikely we'll come out of drought conditions by the winter. And as spring evolves into summer, rainfall becomes less predictable. But we have such a large deficit to make up that it seems unlikely that we'll, in most of the state, recover from the drought during the summer months when, of course, evaporation is higher and water demand is greater as well. So it's looking like it's going to be a 2-year drought. Beyond that, we seem to be in a period of drought susceptibility because of long-term natural variations in the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, which have been in place since about the year 2000, and we have seen several droughts since then. The last time both oceans were effectively stacked against us was in the 1950s and 60s, and I've already alluded to the droughts that occurred in those years. Whether this drought will be broken by favorable rainfall over the next 12 months, or more likely the next 24 months, or whether it may turn into a drought similar in duration to some of the droughts we've had in the past, is unknown at this point. Over the long term, I mentioned a gradual rise in precipitation. With climate change, the model projections indicate a slight decrease, but relatively small compared to the natural variations we've seen from decade to decade due to the ocean variability. However, temperatures are rising globally as well as in Texas, and that means that future droughts will likely have more evaporation associated with them, and consequently the water that falls in the state will not go as far and last as long as it used to. Thank you.
Members, questions? Members, if we could, for one, take a break and get the clerk call the roll, please.
Senator Frazier?
Here.
Senator Estes?
Here.
Senator Dole?
Here.
Senator Duncan? Senator Alkive? Senator Hager?
Here.
Senator Hinojosa? Senator Jackson? Senator Nichols? Senator Seliger?
Here.
Senator USD?
Remember, the quorum is present for natural resources.
Clerk will call the roll for agriculture and rural affairs.
Chairman Estes?
Here.
Senator Urasti?
Present.
Senator Hager?
Here.
Senator Hinojosa? Senator Jackson?
Quorum is present. Thank you, Chairman.
And Commissioner, if you'd like to take off, please identify yourself for the record.